Vraiment instable. Des fois, ça connecte, des fois, ça connecte pas.
Tu crois que c'est instable?
Ça, le système. Là, j'ai pu connecter, là. Ok, ça marche. C'est pas instable, regarde.
Voilà. À nouveau, vas-y, parle. Là.
Stéphane, est-ce que tu m'entends au Zoom? Stéphane. Stéphane. Ouais. Stéphane.
Allô?
Oui, Mahesh, on vous entend. Loud and clear.
Ok,
Please,
super.
mute.
Exact. Non.
Hi, Pat.
Can you hear us?
All right, let's get started.
We're ready.
So hello, everyone that's watching on YouTube. Welcome to Harnessing Data on Laws and Policies to Fight HIV, and also to the launch of the new HIV Policy Lab. So on behalf of Georgetown University, UNAIDS, the global network of people living with HIV, and Thales Analytics, I want to welcome you and thank all the leaders in HIV who you're going to hear from today as they take a deep dive with us over the next 90 minutes on HIV laws, policies, and the future of the AIDS response. Apologies for the background noise. I'm here in my house where apparently they're moving a garbage truck. If you're signed into Google, you'll be able to make comments and questions, which we'll address in the second half of our program. So I'm Matthew Kavanagh from Georgetown University's International Health Department and O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. The science of HIV has never been better. From innovative antiretroviral drugs to new prevention technologies, we have remarkable tools. We also know a lot about how to deploy those tools. Differentiating service delivery to make HIV treatment easier works. Criminalization doesn't. Yet the story of the HIV pandemic is one right now of high highs and low lows. For some countries and some communities, the last decade has been remarkable. For the HIV infection rate has become rare, has become low. The experience of AIDS death has become rarer still. And many communities are enjoying the benefits of science, but others are seeing growing epidemics. The last decade has seen 10 million people still die of HIV, nearly 700,000 last year, and we are not on track to reach the global HIV goals. Part of the answer to why can be found in laws and policies. So by flying across a border, the policy environment can shift radically. These differences matter. These differences impact people's ability to prevent HIV and to live well with HIV. An adolescent living in Thailand can consent to her own HIV treatment, but if they fly to the Philippines, they cannot. Nor will policy give them access to the newest antiretrovirals. In Namibia or Botswana, people can test themselves for HIV at home, but in Canada, the policy doesn't permit it. A sex worker living in Australia is eligible for pre-exposure prophylaxis in the public health sector, but if they fly to New Zealand, they'll find that they're not included in PrEP policy. But that same sex worker will also find that they're not criminalized as they were in Australia. The picture is complex, and these differences matter for the AIDS response. They help explain success, and they help explain differences. But we need to take on 3 challenges. First, we need to make these policies and these differences transparent. That way we can learn from what works and what doesn't. We can create accountability among leaders. We need to monitor, second, policy over time. We have remarkable surveillance data in HIV. New infections, the number of people on treatment, many other indicators are all monitored regularly, but we're not measuring and surveilling laws and policies. What we don't measure often doesn't get addressed. And we need more research on the impact of policy, the legal determinants of health. Lawmaking and policymaking is how governments take what they think works to scale. And of course, we know that just because something works in the mind of an official or in a randomized control trial does not mean that that policy will have that same effect when taken across the nation. Yet, so today we are very glad to launch the HIV Policy Lab with exactly these functions. We do so with Georgetown, UNAIDS, GNP+, our visualization wizards at Thales Analytics, and support from the PEPFAR program, and with a growing set of partner organizations around the world. The HIV Policy Lab, which is launching right now, is a platform to gather, monitor, and ultimately change policies to get science to people. You can go to www.hivpolicylab.org, www.hivpolicylab.org, and you can see the results of the last year of work. We started with an extensive set of global consultations to identify a set of policies to cover, landing on 33 key issues. We conceptualize the HIV-related policy environment broadly. We have HIV-specific indicators like those around clinical care and HIV treatment, testing, and prevention. We also include policies that are linked to the proven structural drivers of HIV. Written rules that construct society in ways that may help or harm the AIDS response, like criminalization of key populations or girls' access to school. And we also include health system factors, like whether people have to pay user fees at the point of service and whether health spending meets benchmarks, because budgets are policy. So together, these interact. They form a policy environment, and that's what we're addressing. Someone's access to treatment may be as much determined by the health system factors or by criminal law as the clinical guidelines, and vice versa. We then set benchmarks for each policy issue based on the remarkable work over the last decade by the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, UNDP, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, and others who built international standards over the last decade based on science and based on rights. And then for each country, we gathered information for each indicator. And here you can see them. Here's a piece of the data on South Africa. We gathered laws and policy documents. We incorporated formal government reporting through the UNAIDS and WHO Global AIDS Monitoring System. And we added critical data from independent expert groups around the world. All of the sources, you can see them online, and we really thank all of our partners who helped us gather this information. So what can we do with this information? To start, we can compare countries. So here's some global maps. And the global maps show where countries have and have not aligned their policies with international recommendations. Here is PrEP policy. And we can roll those up into a single policy, single indicator, going from the policies to policy areas so that we can see how aligned countries are on specific areas. Here's HIV testing and prevention. And then there's an overall view that shows what portion of the total 33 indicators a country has aligned their policies on. And we can see where countries and regions compare across policy areas, which is what you can see in this visualization. Which countries align more of their clinical policies? Which align less on structural policies, or vice versa? What you can see is that no country in the world has aligned all 33 of these policies with international standards, even though they have been thought of as a core of global governance and guidance and have been advanced with evidence for years. But some countries have aligned many, and we have lots to learn from those. So you can see that wealth does not necessarily make for better policy environments. Indeed, some of the countries whose policy environments are the most aligned with science are lower in middle-income countries that have focused on their political will. You'll also see a lot of diversity. Clinical policies are among those most adopted, which is in many ways good news because it shows that concerted international efforts by technical normative agencies, funders, governments, and civil society can tackle hard policy problems. But you'll see that all countries have not adopted them, and fewer still have aligned their structural policies. So please check out the site. Based on it's a basis for public health officials and governments to learn from one another. It's a basis for civil society and leaders to be held accountable. It's a basis for funders to explore the policy barriers to better use funds. And it's a basis for researchers to explore which policies matter in which contexts, as well as the political and economic drivers of policy choice. The HIV Policy Lab is meant as an open, shared global public resource, and we will update it in real time, encouraging users to submit updated information as policies change, and we hope you'll help us build this. We've tried to make it very easy for you to do so. In the coming months, we'll be reaching out to governments to build off this evidence, building a research network to use this data, and partnering with civil society networks to support strategies for reform. Policy matters. In HIV, it can be life or death. And so by generating policy data, we can measure the policy environment, we can monitor the policy environment, and we can change the policy environment on the path to achieving global HIV goals. So thank you for joining, and let me now turn to our first panel.
Very well, thanks.
So I hope are we just waiting for Rico? Is that right?
But Matthew, you're in Georgetown? You're in DC?
I am in DC.
I'm so sorry, but because of the time.
Let me pretend like I've been awake for hours. Next, apologies. I think we've need to fast forward to the start. Can you see who's muted or not muted, or how we should do that?
Basically,
we'll also try to have an interesting conversation, right? So the point is not pre-prepared. You all are some of the smattest people I know on law and policy and human rights. So deeply appreciate you being here. We'll just dive right in, eh? All right, shall we go ahead, Mahesh? Supporting undermining the AIDS response. Let me briefly introduce our amazing panel. We really thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule, particularly on the sidelines of this incredibly busy UNGA. And so Winnie Byanyima, the Executive Director of UNAIDS, Undersecretary General of the United Nations, former Member of Parliament, Director of Oxfam International, and roles throughout the UN, AU, and NGO sectors. Michelle Bachelet, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, former President of Chile, a position she held twice while also standing up UN Women in between. And Rico Gustav, the Executive Director of the Global Network of People Living with HIV, a widely respected human rights and health activist who has been working at the intersection of HIV, drug use, and key populations since his own diagnosis at 17 years old in Indonesia. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your time. So let me just start by talking about the role of law and policy in the HIV response, which is where I want to dive into. We have, as I said in the opening, remarkable HIV science. And some countries and some communities have seen huge progress, particularly against a disease that has no cure and no vaccine and is so socially embedded. But others have not seen that kind of progress. And so law and policy differences, we argue, lie at the heart of this dual story of progress and lack of progress. The new HIV Policy Lab data and accountability platform we are launching today shows that no country in the world has yet adopted what might be considered the core policies aligned with the science of 2020. 33 indicators that describe the core guidance from WHO, UNAIDS, the Commission on HIV and the Law. And in fact, the median country has adopted just over half of the laws that align with global norms. We do have leaders who have adopted many more policies, especially in East and Southern Africa. A few countries in South America and in Southeast Asia really have led the pack, but even those have some gaps. And some others have aligned relatively few. We've got some countries that have adopted policies with key innovations on new drugs and new technologies, but have policies that undercut that, criminalization or restricting which populations have access to those technologies, or enacting policies that don't make medicines affordable. Others are using outdated technology, but and have not adopted innovations in service delivery, even as they seem to have inclusive health systems in theory. So that's where we want to sit. And I want to just start off by focusing on that question and start with you, Winnie, if you may. Can you draw this connection clearly for us? What is the pathway through which policies and laws end up passed by legislatures that are driving the successes or the failures of HIV? And I think we need you to unmute.
Thank you, Matt. It's really a great honor to be sitting on this panel with both High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet and Rico and yourself. Law is a powerful instrument. Used well, it can protect rights, it can reduce inequalities, and it can ensure the dignity of all people. But used badly, it can violate those same rights, it can drive people underground, it can increase inequalities. So in terms of the HIV, laws that impact HIV, we have laws that are undermining prevention, testing, and treatment, that are stigmatizing and criminalizing and driving people underground. And we have enabling laws that are making huge differences and bringing everybody to access good quality services. We have evidence for this. A recent study in 28 African countries showed that in countries where there are LGBT laws that enable LGBT people to live equal lives, that men who have sex with men are 3 times more likely to know their HIV status than those in countries that have LGBT laws that drive people away, that criminalize and stigmatize. Another study in sub-Saharan Africa showed that HIV testing for adolescents was 74% higher in countries where young people at the age of 15 are allowed to test on their own, not seeking parental consent. There you are. So a story I like to use is that of Malawi, which didn't wait for the laws of the rules coming from WHO to change, but went ahead to allow pregnant mothers to get on treatment, lifelong treatment for HIV, instead of doing the policy at the time of breaking in between and on and off, and now was able to reduce transmission between mother to child so much more than all the countries that were still following the WHO guidelines at the time. Thank God they changed, but women were able to live long lives, children, transmission was reduced for thousands of them. They went on to live healthy lives. Such is the power of policy.
Thanks, Winnie. Let me turn now, High Commissioner. In 2020, we have 25 million people on HIV treatment, but nearly 13 million are not on treatment still. And it's interesting because we've got a decade of the AIDS response, and also, decades of the AIDS response, and also decades of the most important ideas in the human rights system, including the highest attainable standard of health, which has actually been used more in HIV treatment than I think nearly in anything else. And what's interesting to me at this point is that things have become a lot more complex. We can no longer talk in terms of just absolute deprivations as we could early in the AIDS response, right? In 2020, you've got some populations that have access, some that don't. So in 2020, how are you thinking about the intersection of HIV, of health and human rights specifically? And, we know that there are laws and policy barriers that deprive people of access because of inequality, but that's much more complex than just saying the right to treatment per se alone. So how are you thinking about that intersection now?
Well, for me, it's a particular issue because, first of all, I'm a doctor, a medical doctor, and I used to be the epidemiologist on the National Commission of HIV/AIDS in my country before becoming Minister of Health. And I always look at that like a human right, of course, health, like the right to health. But on the other hand, as a scientist as well. So for me, both things are together because science permits us to make the human rights more achievable in the best possible way. So the thing is that I think it's a mix of things, of course. Of course, you have inequalities. You have countries, and we have seen it not only now with HIV/AIDS, we've seen it with COVID-19. I mean, the poor investment in public health in many countries have meant that not only no one was prepared for COVID-19, but on the worst scenario that is happening in many countries of Africa is that in terms of trying to get into a response on COVID-19, they are diverting resources that in the past were for HIV/AIDS or for malaria, tuberculosis, and so on to COVID-19. So now there's a lot of people who are not receiving treatment because of this. So what I think is that usually people don't see the linkage between health and human rights, even people who work at the health sector, because the language is not the language of human rights. But they're not at odds. They are complementary, and I think we need to always think on how we do better. But let me tell you something, Matthew. It will be funny that I say it, but when I was the executive director of UN Women, and I tried to convince a president or a prime minister that they should invest in women, and I would speak about rights, the women's rights, and I realized that to many politicians that doesn't make sense. So I started realizing, and I try to do the same now as High Commission of Human Rights, that yes, it is the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. So how in our narrative, when we try to convince Ministers of Health or presidents or prime ministers that they should invest much more and ensure the best possible testing, treatment, services, etc., which are the kind of narrative that really makes them feel, yes, this is important, I should do this, because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's the smart thing to do. And I think usually when we work on human rights, we tend not to think on how I convince the other. We believe that the human right is per se, of course it is, essential, fundamental, and that will make everybody think that they have to do it, but that doesn't work that way. So I'm always trying to think how can I convince the other person that it is the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do? And I think on HIV/AIDS and on the treatment and on the accompany of many of the people, of course, it is the right thing to do. It is the smart thing to do. We need to empower the people so people can really be pushing bottoms up, the ones who make decisions, so they do the right decisions.
Thanks, and I want to return to this in just a moment. But let me go to Rico for a moment. Rico, you head the global network of people living with HIV, which I know is in deep relationship with key populations networks, young people, and others around the world at the heart of the pandemic. I know GMP Plus has recently been pushing the idea of wellness, right? Not just a lack of illness. And we show in the HIV Policy Lab that most countries have not necessarily adopted the full suite of policies, right? That we've got some countries that have adopted one policy, but not the other. That we really have complex policy environments on the core issues that, you know, that the global community has agreed on. So how do you see how these policy differences are actually explaining not just kind of who has access and who doesn't, but also low rates of viral suppression in some communities and high rates of transmission in others? How do you see the policy environment, and how are you all thinking about that?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Matt. And, you know, every time I introduce myself as someone who's living with HIV, I'm always like, there's always a question in my head whether that's my only identity or there are more than that. And, you know, it's interesting because obviously, you know, someone who's living with HIV have multiple identities and multiple dimensions in their lives. And the one thing that, you know, sometimes us, you know, workers in this sector does not realize are those identities are actually interact with each other. And, you know, I'm a father, I'm also, you know, I'm a worker, a sex worker, a drug user, someone who lives in a country, someone who does not have a country. All of those identities are actually interact with each other and interact with the fact that I'm living with HIV as well. So one conditions in, you know, that influence one of my identity will also influence the other conditions and my identity as well. And I guess this is why, you know, it's important to actually look at HIV as an intersectional issue that intersects with other issues as well. And because, again, as a father that lives with HIV, my fatherhood will influence the way that I live with the virus, but also the other way around, how I live with the virus will influence the way that I carried my parenting style, and et cetera, et cetera. And this is one of the reasons why policy differences can actually explain high transmission rate or low transmission rate, or, you know, high viral suppressions. And it's actually quite simple, because making something available does not make people access it. You have to make sure that people actually have the right conditions and are in the right context to be able to access it. They will have to have the tools and in their lives and in their other identities as well to basically for them to want to access services. And that the key is policies to make sure that people access the right treatment or the right services at the right time when they need it. Policies are the environment that we have. A good policy environment is the environment that we need to create to make sure that there's going to be a good response to the epidemic overall. Thanks for that.
So I want to move us to just start talking a little bit about, High Commissioner, what you were kind of putting out there, right? About how do we actually get there and where do we need to go? Because part of what we're showing in the HIV Policy Lab is a real disconnect between the science of 2020 and the policy environment. And at this point in the AIDS response, how do we move that? And so, as you were saying, as a doctor, as a former Minister of Health, as a former president, you've lived all of the sides of this. You've been the one making the decisions on multiple different fronts. So talk to us about this. What do you think, you know, given that we both see that on key medical policies and on key human rights policies, we've got countries that have not adopted clear guidance. What do you think the AIDS response needs to do differently to really, you know, support policy change overall? Oops, I think we need you off mute, High Commissioner.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have the answer because I asked myself many times, but I think that, well, one of the things that it can be helpful, for example, in countries where they criminalize drug use and drug users, that all the reality of countries who have completely different policies, open policies where they feel that people are not offenders, criminal offenders, they treat them as human beings, they have better results. Much better results in terms of prevention, in terms of treatment, etc. And in Portugal, for example, when Antonio Guterres was the prime minister, they decriminalized the drug use, and they have had a very good result. So I think one should try to collect, and I think the tool that you're launching can be essential in this, because there are good practices, experiences, but many people don't know it. I think the possibility for countries, for governments to know good practices that work well, much better than the punitive one, because the traditional way to deal with many of these issues with drug users or with sex workers or with LGBTI communities in many countries is punitive, is criminalizing. But when you show us, as Winnie was saying, or you were saying as well, and Rico was saying, when you can show that policies that are based on human rights, policies that treat people like human beings and not like criminals, because they're not criminals, they have much better results. And I think also that when some countries see that even its neighbor country did it, it's not, because many times on this discussion, and I have had this discussion with some presidents, for example, of Africa, and they have told me, you want us to be Denmark. We have just came out of, we are in a pre-capitalistic era, don't ask us to think differently on terms of LGBTI community and so on. But when you can show that the neighbor country, who can have a lot of similarities in terms of culture, in terms of tradition, etc., did the right thing, it can be an incentive for them to do the right thing as well. It's not easy, I think, to discuss many of these issues that are so having tied with sexual and reproductive rights are always so complicated for some countries, but it is possible, and I think the policy, the HIV Policy Lab can be a fantastic tool to show what works well, and it can be done. And also can be an incentive for them to repeat the model.
Winnie, can I ask you to come in on this? Thanks for that, High Commissioner. She's articulating a way forward for us, I think, a bit. And I wonder if you can talk about how you're thinking about this. Many people working in government, I think, do want to align laws and policies with what's working to halt the AIDS pandemic. But governments are complicated, right? There's multiple people, there's multiple power sources, policy change is hard, and health officials often have less power. So how do you think the HIV community can better kind of work with leaders in government to tackle some of these harder policy issues, whether it's criminalization of sex workers or people who inject drugs or getting pre-exposure prophylaxis to young women, right? How do we think about these things and empowering folks who want to do the right thing?
Thanks, Matt. I so much agree with Michelle on this. Michelle, I can call you Michelle here, not High Commissioner. So I so much agree with her. I come from movements, and I believe in the power of people and movements. If you learn from the women's rights movement, if we take a lesson from there, women's rights activists took international human rights instruments, took regional instruments, like in the case of Africa, to complement global commitments, and came down to work in countries and show what works, taking from a good practice in one country and pushing governments in another country to make progress. So it's a combination there of using commitments, global, regional commitments. But then the hard work happens in the country. That's where the real hard work is. And in the country, what I've seen we must keep doing is first marshal the evidence, and that you are contributing so well at the O'Neill Institute through the Policy Lab. Marshal the evidence. Policymakers respond to evidence. Secondly, understand the policy process thoroughly from beginning to end and accompany the real change makers in government along that way, so that a policy comes through from formulation to implementation. It is identifying those change makers and people in the movement, working with them, making them visible, giving them credit for the good work that they do, that you can push change right through. And we've seen it happen. Where it's happened, it's where the movement in a country is able to make that close connection with change makers in the government and then getting things to happen. I could give you many examples all day on how this has happened, but I've seen HIV movement people really make a difference in certain countries, but that's because they were able to organize and use their power to influence what happens in government. We have to repeat this. We have to replicate this everywhere.
Rico, can you talk about some of the recent policy victories? I mean, Winnie is opening up a kind of a great opening for you there, right? So how do we think about what are the kind of really interesting policy victories that you've seen PLHIV, activists, key populations won recently, and what does that tell us about how to change policy?
And I think when we're talking about victories in policy changes, I think we also have to acknowledge one thing, that most of those victories are actually victories about fighting so that things are not getting worse instead of things are getting better. Because that is the hardest battle that civil society and key populations and community have to fight. On the ground, there will be some push, political push, some society push to actually establish policies that are actually making things worse. Not even static, but worse. So I just want to recognize that, because I felt it myself when I was in the country, and as a civil society activist and a community organization, it's just like putting fires all over the place, but you're putting fire with only one small napkin, basically. Because often that we're not funded, we're not supported. But, despite all that, I mean, there has been some incredible policy victories. And let me just take an example of Thailand and Malaysia, which is quite surprising because of the regulations, the criminalization of certain drugs there in Thailand and Malaysia. Both countries are well known to be quite harsh in terms of their drug punishment for drug trafficking and drug users. And it's quite surprising to actually see that, the hard work of the society and community and key populations are actually bearing fruit there, simply because it was the right time. Effort has been put forward for a long time. The investment has been made by donors. So it's a good thing. But at the same time, we're seeing things where things regress. Philippines used to be the country that actually really moved forward, progressive in terms of their AIDS policies and others, and it can be overridden by this political power, and just it went into a very different directions. And it's still policy changes, it's still a good policy environment still will give communities and civil society power to actually fight back, and that's the most important thing, right? I mean, when you establish policies and law, you will actually make sure that there will be sustainable way to actually fight and make sure that there's a good response at the country, despite the political instability and others. And I think just one more point that I'm trying to make here is also around, this is why it's important to actually track policies as an environment, not as a standalone law, because you can actually win one policy. And then you will have another policy going backwards, and it's becoming inconsistent, and that will influence the quality of lives. Let me just take an example. My own country, like Indonesia, we don't have any law that criminalizes gay at the national level, but at the district level, the government are free to actually violate the rights based on sexual orientation, which means that there are two laws here that are conflicting with each other, and that will cancel the progress that we have made on achieving victory for one policy. So important to track policies and important to track it as a whole. Thanks.
So as we come to our last couple of minutes here, let me just turn back to the High Commissioner for a moment and just ask, maybe the hardest question right now, which is we are in an era where human rights are remarkably challenged, right? And I think recently in the HIV world, we've often made more technical arguments than we have human rights arguments. Let me ask the impossible question, which is that the wrong direction? Are we missing something by not using more human rights framing? And how are you really thinking about that tension in this era of 2020 where, not everyone wants to listen to science, and also not everyone wants to listen to human rights?
Well, it's true. It's the hardest question because I have seen that. I have seen a backdrop in human rights. I mean, you cannot imagine to include the word human rights in a political declaration among member states. It's almost a battle. And so it's very strange for me to see this. And it's also, as we've seen, and in particular also women's rights, we have seen also certain backlash, if I may say. Even though this year we are on the 25th by Beijing plus 25th, and of course there has been progress on human rights since the declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but still it is so difficult. And I do believe that we need science and we need human rights language. We need both. And science can help the human rights language on one hand, and the human rights language can help science as well. But the truth is that as a trend, I describe myself as a strategic optimist, not necessarily tactically optimistic, but because I see in the current moment, human rights is not something that everybody is pushing for. But on the other hand, I thought maybe, what made us right was the First and Second World War. That made people say, look, no, we cannot come back to live again this kind of terrible things. So I was a little bit enthusiastic, thinking that maybe a positive consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic could be that the world will say, look, we need each other, we cannot do things by ourselves, no one will defeat this terrible thing if we don't work all together, if we don't cooperate, etc., etc. And that could mean also sort of a return to the human rights policies and frameworks and so on. Until now, it hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened. Every country has been trying to solve the problems by their own. Global cooperation and solidarity is not the trend, unfortunately, and I think this is a bad thing. But I will continue fighting to try to insist that human rights are essential, are key, had to be the fundamentals, and I think we have a chance and opportunity on the Agenda 2030, on the SDGs, and also in terms of laws, because there's a lot of articles there that will mean that we have to fight against discriminatory laws. So I hope if COVID-19 doesn't produce the miracle, that the agreement on going to a world that is fair, more equal, because what the pandemic has shown has laid bare all the terrible inequalities that existed for a long time, and also in the intersections between who was more vulnerable. And I hope we learn the lesson and we are able to work together. And I hope if we learn that lesson as well, we will be able also to ensure that the LGBTI community have their rights protected, and that we can have better responses to the people living with HIV and AIDS. So, but that's because I'm a strategic optimist, because if you tell me now, you look out the window, you see this happening? Not yet, but we'll continue pushing together, and with Winnie and Rico and you, Matty, and other, we will have, I hope we can succeed.
Thank you so much. Let me give Winnie the last word here, just to come in on a final piece about how do we use monitoring like this to actually make change in the short term. And I know you all are off to other things, so let me turn it over to you, Winnie.
Well, thanks, Matt. Again, agreeing very, very much with my fellow panelists about the need to assert human rights in this world. We've seen 40 years or so pushbacks against rights. Workers have lost rights to owners of capital. Women have been having pushbacks against the rights they've won. And within that too, people living with HIV have been fighting with their lives to claim their rights to health. And we're seeing pushbacks now against gay men, against sex workers, against those most at risk. We have to continue asserting. Monitoring is a role that was given to us here at UNAIDS when we were first created in 2001 to monitor the progress of countries against HIV. We do that through gathering the data and showing it. And with partners like yours in the Policy Lab, we are going to be able to show very easily where progress is being made and why, and where progress isn't being made and why. And so to come to this purpose of this particular panel, to launch the Policy Lab of O'Neill Institute, I want to congratulate you and say that we're going to use your work to make visible the progress in the world, starting with those countries that are making least progress and supporting them to make more progress. 69 countries still criminalize same-sex sexual relations. 92 countries reported that they have laws that criminalize HIV exposure, HIV transmission. And the vast majority of countries criminalize drug use and some aspects of sex work. Just being able to put that on the table and work with those countries to help them understand why this is not helping them to win the war on HIV and now COVID, and also showing them that other countries have done it and are making progress is so important. So monitoring and using the trends to show how progress can be achieved is so important, and I congratulate you for this work you've done.
Thank you, Winnie. And thank you all for joining us. Again, recognizing how busy you all are amidst the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Commission, and all of the work that you guys are up to right now, Rico. Thank you all very much for joining us. And we really look forward to partnerships moving ahead to turn this into reality to achieve the HIV goals. So thanks you all.
Thank you.
So thanks, everyone. We're now going to switch over to hear from a government leader. And so now, Minister Winnie, if you can come join us. For that, I'm going to turn it back over to Winnie Byanyima, who is speaking with Dr. Edwin Gorataone Dikoloti, who is the new Minister of Health of Botswana. Minister, Director, over to you all.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but I'm struggling to see you. So hopefully we're figuring out the Zoom, eh?
Yeah, it's good.
Great. And Minister, we've got you as well. Thank you. Go ahead, Winnie.
Thank you. I want to start by welcoming Minister Dikoloti of Botswana, Minister of Health. I also want to start by congratulating O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health at Law at Georgetown, GNP Plus, Talos Analytics, our partners in launching the HIV Policy Lab. Congratulations, partners. This is so important. Minister Dikoloti, I hope I'm saying your name right. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this launch. In recent years, Botswana has been one of the leading countries in adopting new treatments and switching policies when new science came out, sometimes even before the WHO had issued new guidelines. Can you tell us about some of the recent policy shifts and what has motivated the government of Botswana? You're a leader here.
Thank you very much, Winnie. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. You know, as a country, health has always been, top of our priority. And we have made a commitment as a government to make sure that we end this AIDS epidemic as a public health threat by the year 2030. We have been, in the lead in so many initiatives. For example, we were in the lead in terms of using the treatment regime for DTG, which suppresses the viral load to undetectable levels, which renders this undetectable level untransmissible. So these are some of the initiatives that we have taken the lead as a government on to make sure that we are in the forefront in terms of saving the lives of our people. We have also been in the forefront as a way to also build on our knowledge-based economy to make sure that our people are well informed, and in terms of getting them to be up to standard with the latest in terms of their participation in the AIDS conferences. We have been taking the lead in that, and we've been doing this in such a way that we also collaborate very well with our partners, and this has really given us the lead in terms of our approach. We have also, as a government, introduced policies such as same-day initiation of people on ARVs, and such has really given us proper or good adherence, because through that we are able to initiate people a lot earlier. And we have also introduced with such to give people a month-long treatment for HIV. So all these programs put together, they have really put us in the forefront. And a critical component of this is your adherence by your people to treatment.
Amazing. And I think you're able to do all this because you have a committee for clinical guidelines that is multi-sectoral and that works very closely with the government and with the business and with other stakeholders. So much to learn there. I have another question for you, Minister. And this is, could you talk to us about some of the social and medical policies that have shifted in recent years? Again, we've seen some leadership from Botswana on taking forward the science through your social and medical policy. Tell us more about that.
Thank you. As a result of a study that was done in 2014 through the legal environmental assessment with the assistance of UNDP, there was an assessment that was multi-sectoral that showed to us that there's a huge population that was positive of the expatriates or the foreigners, which took upon us as a government to make sure that we intervene in such, because without providing treatment for those people, it also exposed our people way too much. So last year, September, the President of the Republic of Botswana, His Excellency Dr. Masisi, he announced the shift to extend the free HIV treatment to our foreign residents, which helped a lot in closing this gap. This was also achieved through our partnerships with partners such as PEPFAR, which supported us and even helped in funding for this. You must also remember that we have some stigmas that comes with some of the sexual activities within our communities. We have had challenges with people stigmatizing against those that getting involved in same-sex sexual activities. But we have since accepted that we have to live with such, and it's very, very important for us to acknowledge and appreciate that people have choices, and with such we cannot deny them treatment, because our objective is to really try and see how, as a government, we can control and reduce the rate of infection from HIV.
We absolutely look up to Botswana on these policy shifts. You've mentioned the shift of treating immigrants for free as well. This is critical. Our evidence shows that migrants are one of those, we call it key populations, groups that are marginalized, and as a result, they are not able to access treatment, and then the epidemic continues because they are part of society and they transmit because they are not on treatment to suppress the load. So your step to treat migrants helps to actually win the battle against AIDS, because now everybody is being served. When you make sure that everybody has a right to health, that is the chance you have to end the epidemic. So we look up to you. And again, on the issue of same-sex relationships, in many countries of Africa, it is still criminalized. Same-sex relationships are criminalized, but you lifted that law, you removed it, and that also brings people who have same-sex relationships come forward and claim their right to health and become healthy and not transmit the virus. So we congratulate you on those policy shifts that are informed by the science and that will make you win and control the HIV epidemic. Thank you so much for your leadership and the president's leadership and the first lady, who is our champion as well. I thank you. I hand it back now to Matt.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. Thank you, Winnie. Thank you very much. I think these are critical, and this is what we're going to be monitoring. This is what we're going to be looking at. And as policies change, this is the point that we want to make, which is that the policy environment can matter just as much as the epidemiologic environment and the service delivery environment. And on that note, for our third piece today, we're thrilled to welcome two leaders in global AIDS financing. For this session, I turn to my colleague, Keletso Makofane. He's a scholar at the O'Neill Institute, a member of the governing council of our partner at the International AIDS Society, and a doctoral candidate at T.H. Chan School of Public Health. So over to you, Keletso, Angeli, and Harley.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. It's my privilege today to be with you all, even though it's virtual, and to introduce and to be in conversation with leaders from the Global Fund and PEPFAR. Dr. Angeli Achrekar serves as the Principal Deputy U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, the second in command, managing the daily oversight, coordination, leadership, management, and implementation of the nearly $6 billion per year U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR. She has dedicated her career as a public servant to global HIV/AIDS, women's and girls' health, and global public health development. After working in India and later with UNICEF headquarters on adolescent health and multiple areas, including HIV, she started her work at the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention about 20 years ago, and has been working on PEPFAR since its launch in 2003. Dr. Achrekar has been at the State Department since 2010. Welcome, Angeli Achrekar. I'm looking forward to be in conversation with you. I'm quickly going to introduce the second panelist as well, and then go into the conversation. And that's Dr. Harley Feldbaum, who is Head of Strategy and Policy at the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. He has led the development of the Global Fund's 2017 to 2022 strategy called Investing to End Epidemics, as well as revisions to the fund's allocation model for greater impact. He also coordinates secretariat and board level strategic decision-making, and he previously served as the Director of Global Health, Food Security and Development at the US National Security Council. He also served as Director of the Global Health and Foreign Policy Initiative and a professorial lecturer at the Johns Hopkins NITSE School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Feldbaum also worked for a time as an interviewer and analyst on the Baltimore City Needle Exchange vans, as a loose scholar in Thailand, and at the Nagetad refugee camp with refugees from the Bosnian War. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us, and I look forward to having a conversation, which I'm going to dive right into. Over the past decade, science has advanced quickly on HIV and transformed the response, even though we're still waiting for a cure or a vaccine. Translating scientific gains into policy, however, has been quite uneven. What do you see as the most important policy shifts in recent years that are really having an impact on an effective response and on the epidemiology of the HIV epidemic? I'm going to turn to you first, Angeli, if you could respond to that prompt.
Thank you so much, Keletso. And I really want to first express my thanks to all the incredible partners that have come together today, and really congratulations to all on the HIV Policy Lab launch. It's really an extraordinary effort, and we are fully committed to it. It's such a humbling experience to be a part of a panel, even just hearing the folks that went before on this important topic. So Keletso, to answer your question, I think, it really gets to scientific advances are absolutely critical, but they're only possible when it relates to policy and how those policies are enacted and implemented for the people that they're intended to serve. And so I think as we reflect on, the question about what policy shifts are really having the most important impacts, it really gets down to how are we impacting the clients that we are privileged to serve. And so there are a few that come to mind, some of which the Honorable Minister from Botswana just noted upon, that I'll talk about. But what we've been seeing in the PEPFAR supported response is there are a few key client-centered policies that have gone into place that have really made a tremendous impact. The first is precisely TLD, which the minister spoke of. It's been really extraordinary to see how this particular regimen has really led to the curbing of the disease, but specifically as we look to viral suppression. We've seen, for example, the extraordinary results that the minister described in Botswana. We've seen this in country after country on the continent of Africa and across the globe, that TLD really, really matters. In Zambia, for example, what we've seen is pre-TLD transition, a 75% viral load suppression. Post-TLD transition, a 91% viral load suppression. That is extraordinary. Now that's a subset of a population of newly identified positives at a 6-month period. But again, the incredible impact that transitioning to TLD has had on clients. I think the second important or another critical policy shift has been multi-month dispensing. And this has become more real than ever in the context of COVID-19. We are seeing country after country moving to greater either 3 or 6 months of multi-month dispensing. This has been so critical, particularly in the context of COVID-19. Again, tremendous impact on the clients that we're serving and enabling them to be protected, from going into the clinic where they could be at risk of exposure to COVID-19. But again, having the drugs that they need to ensure that they are safe, having 6 months of drugs has been absolutely critical. And I think another that I'll just in final close on is decentralized drug delivery. Again, all of these policies really relate to clients themselves and what makes sense for the people that we are serving. Decentralized drug delivery has been extraordinary. We need to get to where clients are. And again, particularly in this context of COVID-19 and ensuring that we are working with countries, with governments, with communities, and with clients themselves to make sure that drugs reach where they are, whether it's at their home, in their community, closer to where they are is absolutely critical. So those are a few that I would just note.
Thank you. I think it's striking that two of the three big policy shifts are not biomedical advances, but rather the design of services and making sure that that design wraps around the needs of the people who are using the service. Okay, I'm going to put the same question to you, Harley. What do you see as the most important policy shifts in recent years that have an impact on the response?
Thanks, Keletso, and great to be with you. And thanks, Matt, and congrats on this launch, Policy Geeks Unite. I think this is really exciting work. Angeli's done an excellent job answering on some of the client-facing changes and policy shifts. So full agreement on TLD, the multi-month dispensing, particularly in the context of COVID, and decentralized drug delivery. I just mentioned two other kind of big picture ones because I think those categorize well some of the most important ones. One, I think the big picture framing of access to treatment and the series of policy shifts that have gone from treating at 200 CD4 to test and treat, and then the framing underneath that of 90-90-90 or 95-95-95, I think has been an exceptionally powerful global framing for driving increasing access to treatment and breaking it down across who knows they're infected, who's actually achieving treatment, and then who's virally suppressed. And that framing, I think, has been pretty essential to the scale up of treatment we've seen globally. We're saving a lot more lives because of it. I think one of the harder things to see and what's differentiated by country is whether or not we're reducing incidence enough as a result of that. And that's probably some complex combination of epidemic dynamics, a lack of full viral suppression, and some of the fact that the people who are left behind under even a 90-90-90 scenario are often those most at risk and where a lot of the incidence is occurring. And the second big policy shift, I think, maybe a little bit longer time frame, but if you look back to the founding of PEPFAR, the founding of the Global Fund, these were emergency responses, donor-driven, donor-funded, and what you've seen recently is just a huge uptake of domestic financing for HIV. It's not enough, and there's a huge push we still need to go on it. And in fact, I hope we talk a little bit later about some of the one of the few places the Global Fund does have some conditionality on policies is on domestic resource mobilization. But that shift to more than 50% of the pandemic being funded by domestic resources is just a sea change. And it enables us to talk about scale that we couldn't do if it was just PEPFAR and the Global Fund working together. And more importantly, there's just an enormous amount of country ownership and driving, and it enables you to do things like begin to consider integration with health insurance programs and other types of domestic resources that are just couldn't be considered in the early years of the epidemic. So I just flagged those two as two other kind of big picture shifts.
Thank you. I want to turn a little bit to now the relationship between changing policy and the effectiveness of funding. I know I've heard before in PEPFAR meetings and COP meetings that the policy environment is of particular concern because it potentiates or it modifies the effect of the funding on the epidemic. So that kind of logic that policy helps many to have a bigger impact is part of the workings of at least PEPFAR. I'm sure Global Fund also considers the effectiveness of the funding. I wanted to ask both of you, and I'll start with Harley this time, what evidence do we have around this area? Are there countries you can point to or policy areas that you can point to where there is a clear shift in the effectiveness of funding with a change in policy?
Thanks, Keletso, and it's a really fascinating question. I mean, honestly, I think we have a clear social experiment with COVID in that you have the world's population is immunologically naive. For death rates, you do have some differential age structure and social determinants of health that impact death rates, but the impact of policies on a novel virus across the world on the spread of that virus is pretty clear. With HIV, it's a little harder to tease out because you've got a much older epidemic. You've got layers upon layers of history and growth and interventions, thankfully. The clearest social experiment I could think of when pondering this question was perhaps comparing Russia and Ukraine. They're broadly similar in terms of incidence and the epidemiology of the disease. It's not particularly a funding issue, although I'm sure as folks on the call know, the global funds come in for a fair amount of criticism for stopping funding at one point and now restarting some degree of community funding in Russia. But again, it's not really a financing issue. These are very different policy environments where in Russia, there's a significant amount of funds, a very big focus on treatment, but very little prevention, and obviously extreme stigma and discrimination and no harm reduction services. Whereas you have a really different type of situation in the Ukraine. I'm not pretending to be an expert on either of those situations, but the embrace of some of the harm reduction services, the engagement of communities in the response, just looks really very different. And that's perhaps the best kind of natural experiment I could think of. The one other thing I'll say, and I know folks will know this, but it hasn't really, or Rico brought it up briefly, is there's a very big difference between the law and the practice. And I think I am 100% supportive of this effort. I think as we go forward, though, you have to keep in mind the fact that you could have no laws and such extraordinary stigma and discrimination that people avoid accessing public health services. Similarly, you can have places where laws have been changed to be quite positive and progressive, and it has not changed the facts on the ground in terms of people's ability to access services or the stigma and discrimination they face there. So that's a confounding factor, if you will, for some of the policy changes. Thanks.
Thank you. And again, highlighting the importance of having relationships with civil society, who of course can point out when there are differences between what the government says and what the government does. I'm going to turn to you, Angeli, and ask the same question. Are there particular policy areas or countries in the PEPFAR program where you've seen a shift in funding, a shift in policy lead to efficiency in funding or a bigger impact in funding?
Yeah, thanks again, Keletso. I think this is a really important question, and I agree with the reflections that Harley provided as well. I think a really important picture that you painted between Russia and Ukraine, for instance. But perhaps what I could offer is kind of reflecting a bit from the previous panel with the executive director from UNAIDS, Winnie, and also the Honorable High Commissioner, and then also pulling in on the framework that Harley, you talked about earlier related to the 90-90-90 and 95-95-95. What I focus in on is user fees, for example. You know, truly health is a human right, but as the High Commissioner said, you know, science permits us to make this a reality. But in the end, it's all about access. If user fees, informal and formal user fees, are preventing access to services, then what do we do for HIV? How does that then contribute to the advancement of HIV services or the detraction from HIV services? And so this is just an example that I talk about because we've been actively trying to chip away at the elimination of both formal and informal user fees. We've seen a lot of these user fees in Western Africa, for example. And one country that I can, talk about it as an example is Cameroon, for instance. We have seen over time the impact, the negative impact that having these informal and formal user fees have had on the clients that we are trying to serve for HIV services. The inability to even get through the door to begin to access services is a problem. So again, we have been working hand in glove with the government and working with community to hold all of us accountable and monitor what's been going on with the elimination of user fees, working with the Ministry of Health, working with the Ministry of Finance to ensure that the government is truly on board with eliminating those user fees has been a really important policy shift that has yielded greater impact. The country, Cameroon, has made extraordinary strides in their commitment to eliminate formal and informal user fees. And this has only enabled us to have a greater impact on the HIV services. So again, I think this is just an example of something that has really, really helped move the dial as it relates to access.
Thank you. That's a pretty concrete example and a concrete example of change. I want to now switch to how we monitor such changes. Data matters a lot. Both of you spend a lot of time with it. And the HIV Policy Lab is, the intent of it is to turn HIV policy information into data, measuring and representing both quantitatively and qualitatively what the policy environment looks like across 33 different indicators. So I want to ask you, Angeli, PEPFAR has really led a huge push on the use of data among countries. How do you see country teams using data such as that in the HIV Policy Lab? Are there ways at PEPFAR headquarters that you might use this data in concert with your performance data and your epidemiologic data?
Thank you so much, Keletso. I think this is a really important piece. And as you know, I mean, data are really important to us. They're important to us because every single data point reflects a human being that we are serving. And if we are missing, if we are not performing together, who we're missing. As you know, we look at data at a very granular level, not just at the national level, but all the way down at the provincial, at the district, at the site, at the community, by age, by sex, by population type. I mean, it really matters what we're doing in terms of progress that we're making, but more importantly, what are we missing? And then what do we do? I think the policy data that is coming out of the Policy Lab is absolutely critical to complement the epidemiologic and performance data that we have. I think Matt's point earlier about ensuring that this policy information is transparent is critical. I think triangulating policy data along with performance data and then really understanding what is happening at a local level, at a site level, at a community level, with a population, with respect to the policy and its implementation, I think is really important. So again, we feel that we can really bring to bear and help triangulate this important universe of data that now exists with the policy, the HIV Policy Lab. The point that I would also want to emphasize here is the monitoring component, and that's the second piece that Matt described in his earlier remarks, and that we've talked a lot about, Keletso, during our country operational planning. Monitoring from the community's perspective is really critical. Community-led monitoring to really validate what is it that we're seeing on the ground. What is it about these policies? Are they truly being implemented in the way that they should be, reaching all populations and in the way that they should? So that validation of what's going right, what's going wrong, in terms of the implementation of the policy at the site of the community and where the clients are is really critical. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Harley, I'm going to put the same question to you. I know you're a social scientist by training, who's now managing a major global fund strategy process. How do you see this information coming into play in how the global fund thinks about strategy?
Thanks. It's not a simple question. I mean, I think Angeli's answer is a really good one in terms of dealing with policy change at a local level and linking it really closely to performance. I guess one of the ways, I mean, we're obviously thinking about it as the context for some of the biggest challenges we face in HIV in terms of reaching the most vulnerable populations, in terms of overturning stigma and discrimination. I just want, you're talking to two donors here, so I think it's helpful to note also that how this does have to be country owned and country driven. And so one of the more interesting things the Global Fund's done in recent years is work on breaking down human rights barriers to public health services, specifically HIV and TB services, and increasingly malaria services. And this has not been, again, recognizing that there's a difference between law and practice, and there's a continuum. it's been really focused on changing barriers to accessing public health care, because that's really the part of the human rights problems that the Global Fund in particular cares the most about and can do something about. And the way we've done that in that series of interventions in 20 priority countries has been to make matching funds available for reducing human rights barriers to care, working with the country, so incentivizing at first step, working with the countries to set a baseline of the current status of key policies and barriers to care, holding multi-stakeholder meetings in those countries, and then coming up with national plans. So those plans are not Global Fund plans. They are the country's own plans that are based on the data and the evidence and the performance that are then driven forward. And I just think that's a really important distinction to keep in mind. None of the social change we're seeing in my own country is driven externally. And I think Michelle Bachelet mentioned as well her view that in the women's rights movements and other movements, these are locally owned efforts. They pull global tools, best practices, sometimes pressure from neighbors and support from allies, but these are locally owned efforts. And I think that helps us focus on the impact of these policies. It helps us focus on reducing the impact of negative policies, even when the laws remain intact, and in the long run, potentially changing those laws. So those are, I think, two ways we're thinking about it in terms of the strategy and Global Fund practice.
Thank you. This actually leads into the next set of questions I had for both of you, which is about what you do about policy when it's broken. So many have been critical of purse string aid that uses funding in problematic or even neo-colonial ways to force countries to adopt certain policies. Yet sometimes these are life or death policies for people living with HIV, for sex workers, for people who use drugs, for gay men and other men who have sex with men. What can funders do to avoid this trap, to both advance good policy while not being completely coercive in how that happens? Harley, maybe if you can elaborate a little bit on the examples you'd started on, how you transform policy in places, and maybe if you could hone in on policies that are difficult for countries to engage in. So not consensus stuff, but like same-sex sexuality stuff, sex worker stuff, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's a hugely important question. It takes a partnership. And again, starting with the country, starting with local communities, extending to local governments with support from outside as needed. I think I'll just note again, the breaking down barriers work has, when it's country driven and with support of external partners, has done some really cool things in terms of pushing boundaries. I think some of the harm reduction boundaries in not just Ukraine, where no IDs are now used for accessing government harm reduction services, and now naloxone's being rolled out in prisons, but in Sierra Leone, where the first needle exchange program was launched. So there's some good work that comes on board with slowly building through that process of incentivizing, discussing, working with local actors, and trying to get as far as you can. There are other places, for example, on criminalization laws for men who have sex with men or LGBTI community. As Matt, I think, noted earlier, even though there's evidence is not the only thing that determines policy. I think the evidence is really clear on that point. Politics, economics, other social factors are hugely influential. So changing those policies, I think, we have to look at that as a part of a continuum. Again, recognizing that policy change on those sensitive subjects does not come from external parties. It's not me in Africa talking about what I think. And as I think one of the speakers also noted, you can't ask us to be Denmark today. There's some obvious pushback there. That's not to say we shouldn't push. I think there's a lot of things to do behind the scenes as well. Oftentimes these policies are caught up in political election cycles. There's a lot PEPFAR, Global Fund, other actors do together to minimize the impact of those policies on our actual programs. There are often somewhat sympathetic ministries of health that do want to see the programs continue, but that certainly understand the broader political context. So we struggle as best we can with the tools we have and to support local actors to do as well as we can on those tough topics. The only place I think we are, the Global Fund in particular, perhaps more forward-leaning is on additionality and the commitment of domestic funding. And that's because if the Global Fund's finances are not additional, our whole reason for being goes away. If they are replacing instead domestic or domestic funds, then we're not going to get to scale. We're not going to end HIV. We're not going to scale up programs. So the Global Fund has had a history of being more clear about country co-financing requirements because it's absolutely essential to our mission and to the overall fight against HIV and TB and malaria as well. We're quite flexible on those in low-income countries, but more targeted as countries become wealthier. And again, that's one place as a financing agency where we do push quite hard.
Thank you. Angeli, a similar question. How do you all at PEPFAR think about the balance between advancing policies that are life-saving and respecting the autonomy of countries and not being coercive in that manner? And I guess to spice things up, if you could think of an example where it has been difficult, if you can think of such an example, and what kind of support from other role players, civil society, other governments would help to advance policy.
Yeah, thanks so much, Keletso. And I think Harley really covered a lot of critical aspects that I would have covered. So thank you, Harley, for being really comprehensive in your response. Just to amplify a couple of the points that Harley made that I think are really important in striking this balance, because as you state, Keletso, that balance is truly incredible and incredibly important. We cannot sit back and not really advance good policies because they matter to the people. Yet we have to ensure that there is a local political will, that there is an ownership that exists at the country level to really move this forward in a way that works. So I think the piece that Harley commented on earlier about transparency and a conversation a planning conversation that happens together, right? As we do in the country operational plans, with the country governments, with the civil society, with the multilateral partners, with the governments themselves, with the US government teams. I mean, having a transparent conversation, and we've kind of boiled it down into our minimum program requirements, right? These are policies that need to be in place in order to move move impact for HIV services. And so, I think having that transparent conversation together with all those partners is absolutely critical. And then holding each other accountable. I think to your question about, where have there been some really challenging policies? I mean, you name it, we've experienced it, right? I mean, there have been so many challenging policies. When we think about marginalized groups and really ensuring that those populations are accessing the services, and the type of stigma and discrimination and the type of, just issues that they have to confront in order to access services that should be required by all has been a real challenge. So working with civil society behind the scenes, as Harley noted, but also in front, empowering civil society, having them be fully funded to be part of the response in this community-led monitoring, for example, that I talked about earlier, bringing them into the conversation to be partners with all of us in advancing these good policies are critical. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I wish we had more time, but we have to kind of move on. To be continued as always. Thank you, Dr. Angeli Achrekar from PEPFAR and Dr. Harley Feldbaum from Global Fund for sharing your thoughts with us. And it is my hope that we will continue to work together, to think together about how to advance policy as it relates to the HIV response. With that, I hand over back to Matt. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keletso, and thanks, Harley, thanks, Angeli, and thanks, everybody. So I want to close with just a few thoughts. First, thank you to all those who have joined us online, those of you who will join us in the future watching this, to our speakers, and to everybody here. I want to close with a couple of themes. First, you can go to the HIV Policy Lab where you can see the tools. You can also help us. You can update them. Our goal is that this is an open public resource. See something that needs to be updated, send us that information. Meanwhile, tools only matter if they are used, right? And so this website is a start, but not an end, right? It is the beginning of a process to try to improve the HIV policy landscape around the world. Let me thank all our partners, UNAIDS, GNP+, TELUS Analytics, support from PEPFAR, USAID, and CDC. And also, if everybody online will allow me, a slew of acronyms just to support. So UNDP, who have helped us on the LEAs, data partners who have helped us gather, and advocacy partners who will move us ahead. IAS, IAPAC, Fast Track Cities, Section 27, C-HELP, Asia Pacific Network of People Living with HIV, Temple Center for Law and Policy Research, Medicines Law and Policy, IDPC, ITPC, HealthGap, AVAC, NSWP, HRI, ILGA, HIV Justice Network, and apologies to whomever I've forgotten. Look, some key themes emerge. One, law and policy matters, right? This is about lives, and that's the point that we're trying to get through today. Every single country in the world has work to do. We track in the Policy Lab so far 33 indicators across all 194 member states of the United Nations. These are not aspirational. These are baseline recommendations with evidence behind them. Every single indicator we track has some countries who are leading. So while on the one hand, this is bad news because we would hope that we would see most countries having adopted most of these policies, if not all, every single country could adopt some further policies. But the good news is that in every single policy area, whether it is on clinical and treatment policies that advance the best science and best treatments, whether it is on HIV prevention and putting out new technologies, but also focusing on the structural barriers, criminalization, deprivation of access to education. These are also policy areas, and there are some countries that are leading there. The world is heterogeneous. The world is complicated. And the good news is that some governments are moving. But also, as we heard from Rico describe, the point here is that the policy environment as a whole matters more than picking out any single law. We also heard monitoring has power, and we hope that it does. We hope that transparency can help, and that then it's a starting point for policy folks within all of the sectors to move. We're in a very hard moment in the fight against AIDS. But where we've come from can help where we're going. Success among some does provide a roadmap, right? We need new approaches, but we can also learn from those who have succeeded, those who have been reached, those who have had their needs met. But those who have not been reached, who have not been supported to get on and be retained in HIV treatment, who are experiencing HIV transmission, those are the people for whom the AIDS response, as we've constructed it thus far, with all of its policy barriers, is not yet working for. So what's next is, let's take that seriously. Can we work together to address, can we work together to address those, together? Researchers need to evaluate, governments need to lead, some are, civil society needs to hold them accountable, activism, community-led monitoring, policy change efforts, funders need to support this kind of law and policy reform over the long haul. Researchers need to evaluate this, and if we do those things, we think we can actually halt the AIDS crisis. So a final request, go to hivpolicylab.org, look at the country you're in, review the data, share any updates we may not have, then decide what can you do in the near term to collect, monitor, and ultimately improve the policy landscape. So thank you all. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. Thank you for joining.